The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. Listen, there has been a long history of doping, illegal substance use at the Olympics, but the way drug testing at the Olympics started is a story in itself. Drug testing debuted at the 1968 Summer Games in Mexico City. A nervous Swedish Olympic pentathlete triggered the first positive test. Before the pistol shoot portion of the competition, the athlete drank some beer to calm his nerves down. The alcohol in his system later triggered a positive test, which forced him to give back his bronze medal. So, the first positive drug test in Olympic history was not a more traditional performance-enhancing drug. It was because of beer. Mass Mutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com. The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. Swimming can be a grueling sport, but the challenges these days have nothing on the 1900 Summer Games in Paris. During that Olympics, the IOC ran a competition they never repeated again. It was called obstacle swimming. Competitors would swim 200 meters total. It was held in open waters in the Seine River, and to win, a swimmer would dive into the water, swim, jump out of the water onto a platform, dive back in, swim to a boat, jump out onto the boat and back into the water, then swim under another boat, then swim the rest of the way to the finish line. The event was so hard that not every competitor finished the event. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
A couple of years ago, I was sitting down, taking a break from my job at the Athletic Media Company, and I was drinking a non-alcoholic beer from Athletic Brewing, and I thought, hey, this could be a partnership because I'm an ad wizard, and so I put those two things together, and took a couple years, but now I get to read ads for Athletic Brewing and their non-alcoholic beers, and I'm excited about it. And I'm excited about it because I like the product. I like the product for a variety of different reasons. There are times where I'm the designated driver, and it's perfect for me. I don't feel like I'm missing out on a whole lot. There are also times where I'm not the designated driver, but it's going to be a long day of gabbing, and I don't necessarily need to have 10 IPAs in a row, so I will mix in an Athletic non-alcoholic beer, and I feel like I don't miss a beat, and it allows me to pace myself the way I want to do it. It's perfect for beach days, music festivals, baseball games, camping, late nights. They have a ton of different varieties. They have light, they have Upside Dawn Golden, they have Run Wild IPA, they have a hazy IPA, they have summer seasonals, they've got a lemon radler, Ripe Pursuit. I don't even know what a radler is, but now I want to try it. I feel bad that I haven't tried it. So this summer, ask for the only non-alcoholic beer you need to know, Athletic. Head to askforathletic.com to find it near you and use the code TA2024 to get 15% off your first online order. That's code TA2024 at checkout for 15% off. It's near beer, non-alcoholic beer, and it tastes... Listen, I grew up with some funky ones. Those didn't taste like beer. This tastes like this is good non-alcoholic beer. Exclusions and conditions apply. Athletic Brewing Company, fit for all times.
It's time for a throwback. Hello, Jack Benyon from The Race here to introduce a special bonus episode from our sister podcast on the 1995 Indy 500, which had all the drama you could possibly want from a 500. It was even longer than that and nicknamed the Indy 505. I'm sure many of you will remember me mentioning Bring Back V10s before, but for the uninitiated, it's a show in the Race's portfolio of podcasts which takes a deep dive into a golden age of Formula One from 1989 to 2005, when the sport was loud on and off track. But luckily for IndyCar fans, they also make the occasional foray into 90s IndyCar, as they have on this week's pod, where host Glenn Freeman and guests Matt Beer and Curt Cavin reminisce about the 1995 Indy 500, won famously by Jacques Villeneuve. Had a controversial finish, reigning winners Penske failing to qualify, and the last 500 before the split. So without further ado, here's Bring Back V10s.
There's one race from Jacques Villeneuve's career that he ranks above the epic 1997 F1 title decider at Jerez, where he won the World Championship, and that's his Indy 500 win in 1995. Villeneuve won the race despite having to come back from a 2-lap penalty, which means this race is still affectionately referred to as the Indy 505. This was the last Indy 500 before the dreaded split that did so much damage to IndyCar racing. So fittingly, it was a crazy afternoon with several victory contenders falling by the wayside and a controversial finish that meant the first car to complete the race distance wasn't declared the winner. We're going to explain all of that and much, much more from a crazy month of May in 1995 as Bring Back V10s takes its second detour into a golden age of IndyCar racing. And joining me, Glenn Freeman, to revisit Indy 95 are Matt Beer and a man who has spent a long time embedded in IndyCar racing and was there back in 1995, longtime IndyCar reporter Curt Cavin. Curt, welcome to the show. People who listened to our special episode on Nigel Mansell's 1993 IndyCar season will have heard a few clips from you on that, but I'm delighted that we've got you for the full episode this time. So you can take our opening question. We always start the show in the same way. So tell us, when you think of the 1995 Indy 500, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
I think the first thing is that it was such a long time ago, not only in my career, but also in the sport's history. We've gone through so much as a sport, from the split that you referenced, and we're going to probably get into that because it was such a pivotal moment in the sport's history. But just, how much things have changed, how a Villeneuve has gone from a relatively unknown driver at that point in his life, even though he had a famous last name. He went from being a contender in IndyCar to a champion to a Formula One champion to now his career has gone on, and he's driven a NASCAR, and he just looks like he's such an adult, if you will, now compared to the boy that he was then. And I'm sure that's the case for me. I'm sure it's the case for so many other people that were involved in the 95 race, and so happy to talk about it. Love to talk about the history of the sport, and let's get on with it.
Yep, we're happy to have you as well. And I think Matt and I really were children when this race was on. So. Matt, you and I share a love, though, for IndyCar racing that does go back to the 1990s and predates 95, actually. I think we were firmly embedded in our IndyCar fandom by then. So what are you choosing as your sort of standout memory?
So for me, it's a still image of this race, because this was a season I didn't actually watch the races till years later, because we couldn't afford satellite TV in my family home. I was 14 and I couldn't find anyone to tape it off Eurosport for me that season. 96 onwards, I sorted that. But so I was just following this particular season by avidly reading the Autosport reports, buying Autocourse annuals at the end of the year, and it's that image of Stan Fox's legs dangling out the front of his shattered car and kind of his heels bouncing off the back of Eddie Cheever's rear wing. And obviously I hadn't seen that I only saw the picture of that crash till years later, and I just couldn't work out A, how it happened at all, B, how he came out of it, certainly not unscathed, but alive, frankly.
Yeah, we'll discuss that crash in good detail shortly. Let's hear some memories from our audience next. And to give this episode a true 90s Indy 500 feel, we're going to play the Delta Force theme in the background, just as the TV broadcast in the US always did when commentator Paul Page was doing one of his iconic intros.
The first Canadian on his way to winning the Indianapolis 500. Jacques Villeneuve on the home stretch. And the 79th Indy 500 has been won by Jacques Villeneuve.
Yash says, don't know much about it, but JV winning from 2 laps down. Well, Yash, you are about to learn a lot more about this race. Hope you enjoy it. Andy Campbell says Jacques being 2 laps down and coming back to win. We also had that from Stanley and Russell Tilden, who says this was a big deal in Canada. Talking of Canada, Double Wave Yellow and Alan Roy said they were both hoping for a Canadian 1-2 when Scott Goodyear was leading the race from Villeneuve before he threw the race away. We'll explain in great detail what Goodyear did, although Richard Crossan described it as trying the old light was still changing officer argument on that final decisive restart. The cycling investor was sat in the stands at Indy that day and remembers saying, "What the F is he doing?" as Goodyear overtook the pace car. And Owen Kerwin remembers Goodyear then not coming in to serve his penalty, or as Jacques N. Dressang puts it, Goodyear being a blockhead once he was black flagged. Talking of Goodyear, Christopher DeHardy says, "When I was a kid, I was a bit confused how a driver named Scott Goodyear was able to race with Firestone tyres." Alexander Law says, wondering where the Penskes were, having not paid attention to the lead up to the race. Adam Corlett says Penske failing to qualify after being crushingly dominant the previous year, which was also chosen by Philip Bain and Ed Spencer, among others. Megahorse chose Ari Leindyke flipping the bird at another driver and knocking his own headrest out of the car. Saint of Norfolk says the beautiful player's livery on Villeneuve's car. And Stephen Gate, like Matt, chose Stan Fox's scary first lap crash. Lots of you called it the 5:05 because of Villeneuve's 2-lap penalty. We had that from Justin Mike, Nardenarios, Chris Hoffman, Elegantly Wasted, Joseph Hall, Pascal Fortan, Jeff Murphy and many others. KR1736 calls this the peak of the mountaintop for American open wheel racing. And Stuart Coulter recalls watching this race during lockdown in 2020 and reflecting that sadly this was probably the zenith for IndyCar racing before it went down the path of self-destruction. And to finish, in not quite as triumphant fashion as a Paul Page intro would, lots of you mocked me for picking this race simply because it was a Villeneuve victory. As you're about to find out over however long this show takes, there was a lot more to this race than only the story of the man who won it. Now, I mentioned at the start that this was the final Indy 500 before the launch of the Indy Racing League, which went into competition with the kart series in 1996, splitting American open wheel racing and causing damage that IndyCar's never really recovered from. So where were things at in May of 1995? Things have been pretty tetchy during 1994 after Indianapolis boss Tony George announced his new series at the start of that year. But in the first half of 95, in public at least, things were pretty quiet. By this point, both series had announced their 1996 calendars, and while kart seemed to have some convenient clashes with other races for the new IRL series, it had left May open on the assumption that all of its teams would be racing at Indy. Leading team bosses supported that view, with Carl Haas saying there was not even a question of a boycott of the Indy 500, and Roger Penske said he didn't anticipate any problems, but he did caveat by saying the kart teams didn't yet know if we'll be welcome here. While any talks in late 1994 to prevent the breakaway series starting had come to nothing, in the brilliant book Indy Split, then kart boss Andrew Craig said pretty much nothing happened in the first half of 1995. Now, a lot happened later that year that we'll come back to at the end of the episode. But Curt, you were on the ground there at Indy. You're amongst all of this. Was the split a big talking point during May 95?
I don't remember it being a big talking point. You know, it's one of those things that I think, you know, in our memories, we remember so many good things about a particular moment or an incident or a year. And we tend to overlook some of the things that were going on that maybe weren't so good. And I'm often asked, you know, what's your favorite Indy 500? What's the most dramatic? And there are a lot of races you could point to, but I almost without fail say that the 95 Indy 500 was my favorite for so many reasons that we'll get into in this episode. But I don't remember much about, and I think because I enjoyed the race and the drama that Team Penske, or Penske Racing as we referred to it at the time, you know, the agony that they went through and the various storylines, again, that we'll discuss, I think that clouds the memory of kind of the bubbling that was happening. You know, the other element to all this that kind of made it possible for Indianapolis Motor Speedway was the start of the Brickyard 400, the NASCAR race. And so the funding that was in the Speedway coffers kind of gave them, I'm sure, we're all businessmen to a varying degree, I think it gave them the cushion financially to make the decisions to start the league, start the IRL. And I think all that was bubbling, But I don't think we realized until much later in the year that, or even at the start of 96, that 96 would go as poorly in terms of a true split. So I don't, again, my memory doesn't serve me as real negativity relative to 95. You mentioned John Orvitz's book, Indy Split, great book on that subject.
Incredible.
Yeah, a lot of detail there. I would just say that 95 was still very much a celebration of competition, and the various storylines really revolved around motorsports, not business.
Yeah, and I mean, your memory kind of fits with all the coverage I found at the time. You know, I researched what the European magazines were saying, what the North American press was saying. John's book really does tell the story in chronological order, and it was the same there. There wasn't much tension on the surface at this point. One of the big topics at Indy during practice, though, when the cars were on track, was a growing concern about how fast the cars were getting. The leading cars were running laps at an average speed of 234 miles per hour and hitting top speeds of 239 miles per hour at the end of the straights. This prompted FIA President Max Mosley, a man better known for getting involved in F1 matters, to reach out to IndyCar bosses to strongly urge them to impose a significant reduction in the speed of the cars on ovals. Mosley said in a letter, "The speeds now being reached are very worrying and represent, in our view, a threat to the public as well as the drivers. By acting now, you may prevent a serious incident." Michael Andretti seemed to support the idea, saying that Indy cars were now too fast everywhere, including short ovals and even road courses, after he'd recently lapped significantly under the lap record at Road America in testing. CART moved quickly, cutting downforce for 1996 primarily from the floors of the cars, with a rules package that looked very similar to the initial proposal from the IRL, which that series had to back out of after the suppliers involved in CART had refused to build cars to those specifications. We won't get into the politics right now, Matt, but looking at Max Mosley's intervention, he's a name that will be familiar to F1 fans who always listen to this podcast. Was he right to get involved in the debate over the speeds of Indy cars at this point?
Usually when Max Mosley and Bernie Ecclestone intervened on anything IndyCar related, it was just a stir, just to attempt to kind of knock that series if they felt it was becoming a threat to F1. And obviously at this point, 1995, it's fresh from F1 having to cut its own speeds drastically after the tragic crashes in 1994. So it's foremost in F1's mind. So you could skeptically go, the FIA is noticing that F1's getting slower at a time when IndyCar's getting faster. Is this politically motivated? But being more generous, he had a point. The drivers agreed with it. And as someone who was kind of getting converted to IndyCar from having followed F1 first, I remember being really struck by not how comfortable the IndyCar world was with crashes that caused injuries, but just how relatively frequent they were. And you think of lots of the headline major crashes, things like the one that ended Emerson Fittipaldi's career in 96. There's Nelson Piquet smashing his legs up when he came to Indy, but there just seemed to be so many concussions, so many smaller back injuries. It was part of the scene in a way that I hadn't been used to as a follower of European motorsport before. So as much as I suspect this was Mosley just trying to get at IndyCar a little bit, he was coming from the right place on this occasion.
Yeah, and I guess it's also the speeds I read out there, 234, 239 at the end of the straights, they maybe don't seem that alarming now because we have seen those speeds in the modern era, but this difference in safety is night and day between now and what an IndyCar and that Speedway, this is pre-safer barriers, was like back then. One of the main reasons for the increase in speeds was that Firestone was back in IndyCar racing for the first time since the 1970s. So there was a full-on tyre war with Goodyear, which pushed speeds up, just as it would when Bridgestone took on Goodyear in F1 in 1997. Scott Pruitt had spent all of 1994 testing for Firestone, running nearly 14,000 miles, and occasionally leaking to the press that the tyres weren't very good because he didn't want too many other teams to run them when they came in for 95. But the Firestones were so good that rivals on Goodyear speculated the Firestones would be too soft for race conditions. Now, not for the last time in this episode, we're going to quote an incredible article that was written about this race on the Indianapolis Motor Speedway website, which was called Month of Mayhem, where they spoke to a number of people who were involved at Indy that year. It's so good. I wish articles like that existed for every subject we cover here, because it would halve the amount of research I would have to do. In that article, Bridgestone America's manager of race tyre development, Dale Harrigal, said, that people were calling the Firestone tyres gumballs because they were going to be too soft, but Firestone knew they'd be fine. And Pruitt added that he was very confident Firestone had got it right. He said the tyres were so good that people were saying they must have been illegal, but it was just an attempt to put a negative spin on what a good job they'd done on their comeback. Curt, we'll obviously talk about how the leading Firestone runners performed in the race later on, but how significant was it for IndyCar racing and the Indy 500 just to have Firestone back?
Well, you're talking about one of the major names in the sport's history, and as you go back, as I do on frequent occasions, and you look at historical photos, and Firestone was it. It had won something like nearly 50 Indy 500s in succession, 40, 43, 45. I don't remember the exact number, but you're pushing 50. And so it was such a major part of the sport's history that, it really, and it's difficult now to even put that in perspective because, IndyCar went to a single tire manufacturer, and we talk about the safety elements that, not having two competing tire manufacturers creates, but it's so much more than that. It's the spirit of innovation. It's the one side against another. It's the budget increases as we go, things that in this side of the sport, we just don't have these days because Firestone is the sole supplier, and they've done things obviously with different compounds and an alternate tire and so forth. It is such a foreign topic to have a tire battle, and for new fans, you just can't. You probably can't get your head around it. We have made racing so much safer when teams know the tires are going to be not pushed to the edge in a tire battle. So, clearly it's sort of a different world than which we live in now.
Another company back at the Speedway and looking to make a big impression was Honda. But unlike Firestone, it wasn't returning after a long spell away. Instead, it was back 1 year on from turning up with an engine that its lead driver, Bobby Rahal, had called a disaster. Rahal had to ditch his Lola Honda in 1994 just to qualify for the race, borrowing a 1993 car from Roger Penske, and his Rahal Hogan team split with Honda after just one disappointing year, with Rahal calling the whole project embarrassing for Honda dealers all over North America. But Honda meant business in 1995, turning up with a new engine that was the highest revving on the grid, and it got a car onto the front row of the grid with Scott Goodyear, who was running in a one-off second entry for the Tasman team. Coverage at the time noted that Honda had been run out of here in disgrace after the 1994 qualifying disaster at Indy, but the recently retired Mario Andretti, writing in Autosport magazine's preview of the event, said Honda couldn't be overlooked in 1995, tipping them as his dark horse for the race. Matt, were you impressed by how much Honda had turned its fortunes around in so little time?
Impressed, but not at all surprised. Again, having come from a Formula One fan background, you just expected Honda to do this because of everything it achieved in the 80s and early 90s in F1. It just seemed like a matter of time that it would do it in IndyCar as well. I know other manufacturers hadn't managed that in IndyCar, like the Porsche project and that sort of thing, but I certainly felt Honda was going to do this. Now, that might be with a little bit of hindsight bias because because of everything Honda then did in IndyCar with its complete control of it for a little while. This early 95 performance was the start of a real Honda era. It set the stage for a time when actually you had to have a Honda to have a chance of being confident of being competitive for a while. So yeah, this was just what Honda was going to do in my eyes. And I also think the fact Honda was doing this well in IndyCar was what kept the idea of Honda coming back to F1 eventually so exciting for F1 fans through the 90s as well, because you had that proof over the other side of the water of what Honda was still capable of.
Yeah, I think if anything, the real surprise, given their F1 pedigree, was how bad the first engine was the year before.
Yeah.
So Goodyear stuck a Honda on the front row, but that was only good enough for third on the grid, as ahead of him were the dominant Team Menard's run Buick-powered cars, which were always fearsomely fast in qualifying during this era. The team had been running its stock block-based engines for 5 years by this point, investing millions of dollars over that time to make them more competitive. Stock block engines were allowed 10 inches more boost than the standard engines, so in qualifying trim, they had an advantage of over 100 brake horsepower. Former Indy winner Arie Luyendyk said the power advantage was so great that the Menards cars could also run more downforce, meaning the handling of the car was phenomenal. The Menard's team had a budget of $6 million just to run the Indy 500, but the Buick engines were never as competitive on race day as they struggled for reliability and found it difficult to run in traffic due to a very narrow power band. But they were first and second on the grid for this race, with Scott Brayton beating Lyondike to pole position. Goodyear lined up alongside them in the 3x3 formation, with Michael Andretti, Jacques Villeneuve and Maurizio Gugelmin behind them on the second row, all fancying their chances in race trim with their conventional engines. Curt, what did you make of this Menard's Buick project that was so visible in the 90s, partly because they were quick in qualifying and partly because they often were quite brightly coloured?
Well, I think you can't say one without the other there. That I think John Menard, the owner of the Menard's hardware business, really more than business, it's really a staple of the Midwestern part of the country, just a real dominant player in the hardware business. But he liked the bright lights, whether that was in qualifying, whether it was in the splashy colors of his car, of him signing at the request of Larry Curry, Tony Stewart the next year, the real American hero, if you will, of short track racing. So there was a lot of splashiness to the program. And I think you can't also discount the fact that John Menard only cared about the Indy 500. Now, obviously, there were some other elements of the sport that he did care for, Milwaukee being near his home base, but it was the Indy 500. And so for John Menard, it was splash in color, splash in speed, splash in Indy 500 exposure, and it really helped his business, really a great use of the combination of business and motorsport, and John was and still is to this day just very splashy when it comes to being involved in motorsports.
Yeah, there's still bright Menards liveries running in NASCAR today. Before we move on, if you'd like to get all of these episodes ad-free, plus access to exclusive bonus content from Bring Back V10s and the race, then make sure you check out the Race Members Club on Patreon. The link is in the description, and if you sign up now, you'll be able to check out our back catalogue of exclusive shows, and you'll have plenty of new material to listen to from us when Season 10 finishes, including exclusive bonus Q&A episodes and the second half of our race-by-race look back at the 1997 F1 season in our Revisited series.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cash Back Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right, you could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
Summer drinking season is long, which is why non-alcoholic beer is a great addition to your cooler. But what makes you reach for one NA beer over another? For me, it's a drinkable NA beer with a familiar flavor and none of the downside. I've been open in the past about my experience with sobriety, and in the 4 years since I stopped drinking alcohol, Athletic Brewing has become a big part of my life and has long been my NA beer of choice. They have a ton of different styles to choose from hazy IPAs to cerveza-style NAs to your more traditional golden ales. When I got married last summer, Athletic was the NA beer of choice at our wedding. Athletic Brewing is the full-flavored way to feel like you're part of the party while maintaining the benefits of an alcohol-free lifestyle. No matter what you're looking for in a great non-alcoholic beer, the answer is always Athletic. Great flavor? It's Athletic. Award-winning styles? It's Athletic. Huge variety? It's Athletic. From IPAs, extra darks, sours, hazies, and more to summertime favorites like light brews and goldens. It's fit for all times. Enjoy them anytime, anywhere, without slowing down your summer. Beach days, music festivals, camping, late nights, all with zero hangover the next day. You can find Athletic at bars, restaurants, grocery stores, and online at athleticbrewing.com. Athletic is available all over the place these days, including at several of my favorite local bars around Chicago. It's always a comforting sight for someone like me that doesn't drink to feel like I'm welcome at whatever bar is stocking it. For the past 4 years, Athletic Brewing has been a huge part of my life and has helped me maintain my goals and values while still getting to enjoy the best flavor and variety that an NA beer has to offer. This summer, ask for the only non-alcoholic beer you need to know, Athletic. Head to askforathletic.com to find it near you and use code TA2024 to get 15% off your first online order. That's code TA2024 at checkout for 15% off your first order. Near beer. Exclusions and conditions apply. Athletic Brewing Company. Fit for all times.
Another special engine for Indy wasn't on the grid in 1995 due to losing its favourable status in the rules, and that was the Mercedes Ilmor pushrod engine that had dominated the race in 1994 with Penske. Initially, race organisers USAC reduced the boost for the purpose-built pushrod engine to 52 inches, while the stock block Buicks, that's easy for me to say, would stay at 55 inches. But Ilmor reckoned the engine could still be competitive with that level of boost, so it began working on 30 engines for its customers for the 95 race, and it had received 17 orders from various teams. USAC then reduced the boost again to 48 inches, which immediately killed the engine known as the Beast. It was never banned, but it was effectively outlawed by being rendered uncompetitive under the new boost restrictions. Roger Penske took this news terribly, saying at the time, he was as upset about this as anything I've ever experienced in racing, and that the change was based on nothing but politics. Matt, would you have liked to see the Beast engine return in 95? Get another run out?
No. Well, there's a caveat to that. I love that it existed. I love that they did this. I love the quirk of the Indy 500 as it was under USAC, having slightly different rules and loopholes existing. I love that engine was built under such secrecy to do what it did in 94. As a fan, that was fine for me, storyline-wise. That was done. I sympathise with Ilmor getting as far as it did with building so many engines and then it having to abandon that. That's not ideal timing. But when you do this sort of thing in motorsport, when you come up with an innovative breakthrough or a slightly cheeky rules loophole-hugging way to dominate something, you know this will happen. Every team, every manufacturer that has ever done something like this knows that either everyone else will copy you and you'll be in the same position, or you'll get outlawed or semi-outlawed. It comes with the territory of motorsport innovation, so you can't bleat too hard about it when it happens. If they thought there was no risk of this happening, they wouldn't have gone to such trouble to keep it secret in the first place in the build up to 1994. So yeah, I sympathise. I love that it was possible for it to happen. I love the fact that Buicks existed as well. I love that element of this part of Indy 500 history. But the storyline had happened. It was done. Time to move on.
I'm very amused by the fact that anyone involved in this project now says, oh yeah, we knew it'd get banned after the first year. You look at all their quotes from during 1995 and they were livid. But maybe that was just politics, as Roger Penske said. But how Penske could have done with that engine again in 95, as it became clear during practice that their 95 chassis engine package was off the pace. After 6 days of practice prior to the start of qualifying, reigning champion Unser Jr. and teammate Emerson Fittipaldi, the 93 Indy winner, were 28th and 29th on the speed charts. A lack of power wasn't the problem though. Penske just couldn't get its cars to handle well. Unser said at the time that he and Fittipaldi couldn't stay flat through the corners, and he said, if you can't do that, you're nowhere. The issue was understeer in the corners, and whenever Penske tried to fix that with setup changes, the front end became too positive, and that was causing oversteer late in the corners. Because of the lack of speed, Penske didn't even bother running during the first weekend of qualifying. Roger Penske said it was because the team didn't think it would be able to run laps faster than an average of 225 miles per hour, which is what he thought would be the minimum requirement to qualify for the race. While that sounds drastic, this is back when qualifying for the 500 was spread over 4 days across 2 weekends. So Penske was giving itself another week of practice on the assumption that it would get its cars sorted to get into the race the following weekend. Unser said years later the team wasn't panicking when it skipped that first weekend of qualifying because we honestly thought we could get the car working during that second week of practice. Curt, when this storyline was unfolding in front of your eyes at the Speedway, when Penske's struggles were clear and they didn't make a run at qualifying, what was the vibe like? Was it a shock or did people think it's fine, they'll get into the race next week?
I think you just knew they would figure it out. I mean, I think about my nearly 40 years of covering this sport. I'm not sure I can think of a moment. I'm sure I can if I thought about it longer, but a more surprising situation than Team Penske not making the 95 Indy 500. Keep in mind that the rules allowed for a car to be qualified, to have 3 qualifying attempts. Today's format allows for multiple attempts in different manners, and we've changed the process multiple times over the last 2 decades. But in the 90s, you got 3 chances. And so if you spent 1 or 2 of your chances in that first weekend, then you were reduced with your opportunities later. So there was more to it than just, let's just try it as many times as we need to, which essentially you can do today. If you watch qualifying, this year or next year, you're going to have multiple opportunities on that particular Saturday to get your car in the show. And that was just not the case. The other thing that happened, and this sort of percolated to the drama, was we had several days of rain in that second week of practice, which reduced the number of laps and time and energy the team could spend trying to find the speed. And then as it played out on the second weekend of qualifying, the idea that the Team Penske wasn't going to make the race was staggering, and keep in mind that, in fact, I haven't looked to see how many cars were in the qualifying format that year, but it's not like there were just 1 or 2 cars going to be bumped. This was going to be a challenge to make the race. And after they had dominated in 94, it just seemed inconceivable. Roger Penske does not leave. We often will say when the music stops, Roger always has a chair. But in this case, there were no chairs to be had. His car clearly was not up to snuff in this case.
Yeah, so as you outlined a little bit there, things got more chaotic in the second week. Penske dusted off one of its 1994 cars for practice to compare it to the 95 car, but Fittipaldi could only manage a 220 mile per hour lap in that. They borrowed a Reynard from another team, but Unser could only run 218 miles per hour in that, leading one of the mechanics to call it a piece of junk. In the end, Penske took up an offer of running backup Lolas from Bobby Rahal's Rahal-Hogan team, which was effectively payback for when Rahal had to borrow equipment from Penske the year before, as we mentioned earlier, to make the race when his Honda-powered car wasn't fast enough. Rahal said it was a risk to hand over his backup cars in case he ended up needing them, but he felt it was right to return the favour to Penske. This led to the bizarre sight of Unser and Fittipaldi running in the liveries of Rahal and his teammate Raul Boesel, but with Penske stickers such as Marlboro slapped on the side of the cars. And if you're a more recent watcher of the Indy 500, as Curt mentioned, things have changed so much. You might be thinking this is all quite dramatic given these days we might have 1 or 2 cars that don't make the field. I did look this up. Back in 95, there were so many cars entered that there would be 12 drivers who would fail to make the 33-car cut. So Penske had to take this seriously. It wasn't a case of, can you sneak into 33rd place and bump out one backmarker? But Matt, Curt's kind of set the scene for us already. When it continued to snowball and it wasn't getting any better, how bizarre is this? Building into the final weekend of qualifying with one of the sport's greatest teams, then and now, looking like it might not get in.
I think it's to put into perspective for people who weren't following it at the time. okay, you think of Penske being synonymous with success in IndyCar racing, but it was coming off one of the most dominant seasons anyone has ever had. 12 wins out of 16 races in 1994, including Indianapolis. 1, 2, 3 in the Drivers' Championship, the 3-car lineup it had then. It had won the 2 rounds of the series heading into the Indy 500. This was an absolute steamroller. It was a slight surprise it wasn't dominating 95 as it had 94. But the step from there to not even getting on the grid was incredible. And as Curt said, you just didn't expect it was going to go that way. The feeling was always, this will sort itself out somehow.
Penske found some speed for the final week of qualifying. Fittipaldi was 3 laps into a run that looked set to get him onto the grid, but Roger Penske waved it off as he didn't think it would hold up once other drivers tried to beat it. It wasn't until the final hour of bump day, the 4th day of qualifying, that a Penske entry finally got into the top 33 for the first time, with Fittipaldi making the cut with a 224.9 mile per hour run. Unser had an engine problem on his penultimate run, then ran again and just wasn't quick enough. So remarkably, he became the first defending winner of the race to come back the following year and fail to qualify. Unser was in tears, describing the walk back from the pit lane as the longest he'd ever done. At the time, he couldn't find the words to describe it, just saying it hurts an awful lot. When discussing this in future interviews, he'd use words like dumbfounded, crushed, devastated, heartbroken. At one point, he even called it devastation at the highest level. In an interview for a brilliant History of the Indy 500 DVD box set, Unser said he felt everybody was at fault, saying the team went into panic mode. He said missing the 500 was beyond his wildest dreams, as he'd never even imagined it was a possibility, especially with Roger Penske. And I can honestly tell you, none of this is hyperbole. I think we all thought this. Unser discussed at length in his book, which came out in 2022. He talked about this. He said, Penske engineers had been arguing in the meetings during the practice days, and the tension was unbelievable. It blew everybody up. Nobody could think clearly. He also blamed himself for being too cautious on the first lap of that final run. He said he'd done the same the year before, but Penske's advantage was so big in 1994 with the pushrod engine that he'd still managed to get pole by going faster over the rest of the run. But in 1995, his faster final laps weren't enough. We'll stick with Al Jr. for a bit here before we move on to Fittipaldi. Matt, was it fair to assume, like Unser admitted, that when you're the reigning champion, you won the race the year before, you're driving for the best team, is it fair to assume that eventually it's going to work itself out and you'll find a way into the race?
Yeah, it wasn't unprecedented for a big name to struggle to qualify at Indy and to have a scare, but there'd never been, certainly in the time I've been following it, anything remotely on the scale of this, or since, as far as I can recall. So yeah, he was right to have faith. It really struck me when rewatching this race before the podcast. Sam Posey, the ex-racer turned part of the commentary team, came out with a line in the starting preview section along the lines of Penske's aura of invincibility had gone forever after this race, which, thinking about Penske in the 21st century, feels a little bit over the top because Penske's come back to have so much success. But it had a really rubbish end of the 1990s. The Penske chassis program ended up being binned altogether only a couple of years after this. And this Indy 500 non-qualification just really shook your faith in what Penske was supposed to be at that point. And it became, I'm not saying it's a direct line from this to what happened between then and like 1999, but it became a backmarker in IndyCar and had to ditch its own project and go with Reynard Hondas to get back to the form that we all thought Penske should be capable of. So, yeah, you understand why Al Jr. was going, it's me in a Penske, this will be fine. And it wasn't.
Now, Unser nearly won next time out in Milwaukee. It was only a week later. Penske were back on the grid as normal for a regular round of the series. But Matt said you maybe can't draw a line between Penske's late 90s downfall and this race. Maybe you can with Unser Jr. because there was a sad longer term impact from this failure to qualify at Indy. Unser said that was the catalyst for him spiraling into depression and addiction problems that would plague the next 2 decades of his life and eat away at his career as a driver pretty quickly over the rest of the 90s. He never won another race in kart with Penske beyond 1995. So he had a pretty good 95 season, but after that it fell away very quickly. Unser and his wife were already into taking drugs before this heartbreak, and he said in his book that some of his friends had planned an intervention a few weeks earlier when he ended up winning in Long Beach. But after failing to qualify at Indy, he flew home, and in his words, we got into our drugs right away because he wanted to numb myself into oblivion. He also said that week at home, when he should have been at Indy preparing for the race, was the first time I felt true deep depression. He went through the Indy history books himself to learn that he was the first defending race winner to come back the following year and fail to qualify, and he called that a huge moment in my life because now he felt like, in his words, one big failure and his mental stability was crumbling. In 2015, he told the Indianapolis Star that failing to make the race was truly the beginning of his downward spiral and would result in him considering taking his own life years later in 2012 on his 50th birthday. Curt, the spiral that Al went into after this, was this the ultimate example of how much this race meant to him and his family?
Yeah, I think I was waiting for and his family. You know, when you're talking about Indianapolis, and we often will talk about Andretti and certainly Foyt, but it's really the Unsers that essentially put their stamp on Indianapolis history from an initial member of the family losing his life to Bobby Unser winning 3 times, to Al winning 4 times, to Junior winning twice, to all the family members that ran there, next generations that raced at Indy later on after that. To be an Unser means to succeed at Indy. And that's what little Al, you referenced the 2015 Indianapolis Star story. That's the story that I got with him after he came out of treatment. And we sat down, and I remember being in this conference room at Kelly Racing, and just having such great empathy for a man that we all looked up to, one of the finest race car drivers that have ever been behind a wheel. I mean, Junior's ability to street race, to win on road courses, to dominate Indy, and not a great qualifier. So it's not like he just had, massive advantage on people in qualifying. He was such a good race car driver and such a good person to have a spiral like he had. And I don't think, when I read, and then heard later some of his comments about 95 sort of accelerating his demise, if you will, it's not surprising. To be an Unser is to be successful in Indianapolis. I just don't know any other way to say it. And that was such a pivotal moment in his life.
Yeah, I would recommend that people read his book as well. He's been on quite the journey, and he's very open about it. Back to Penske, though. Let's try and work out what went wrong. It's always been considered a bit of a mystery, but Unser's book revealed a few explanations that hadn't really been made public before. During practice at Indy, when Penske borrowed the Rahal backup cars, they copied Bobby Rahal's setup exactly, but Unser said the car tried to kill him in the corners. So that night, Penske took the car into Rahal's garage to use their setup pad, which revealed that Penske's own setup pad was calibrated differently. Unser said the crossweight balance on the front was off by an astronomical amount. That had inspired some confidence that the car would run better the next day, but it still wasn't enough. So what else went on? Unser said he was dumbfounded again when he heard that returning Penske signing Paul Tracy had run 231 miles per hour at a post-season test at Indy later in the year, and Unser said the car I had fought with was now running incredibly fast. He was told that the team put its 1994 underbody on the 95 car, plus they were running in faster, cooler temperatures, and the track had been resurfaced. But the biggest discovery was that the team ran a softer anti-roll bar on the front of the car. And Unser wrote in his book, "The one we had used in May was so stiff, our in-car adjustments made almost no difference, and it wreaked havoc on the handling. For the span of the original test sessions and the month of May, no one had thought to change to a softer bar." Curt, that obviously makes it sound so simple once you change to a softer bar and it works. Is this perhaps a sign of just how the pressure at Indy can prevent even the best teams from perhaps always thinking clearly? The fact that this didn't come up for somebody to try in May?
Yeah, you think about, how many challenges Team Penske would have faced before that, to not be at the front of the field, much less to make the race. And so, pressure, people react to pressure in different forms. The other thing that I'm struck by, and I knew this, but listening to you say it really creates a moment for people who follow the Indy 500 today. It causes pause, is today we're talking about a separation of the top half of the field by like less than a second. Or certainly you'd have multiple cars within just a fraction of each other over a 10-mile qualifying run. You're talking about Little Al struggling at 218 and the field needing to reach 225 to make the race. That's such a big separation in today's game. It's almost difficult to get your head around that they were off that much. Of course, again, today's environment and the landscape has changed so much. The equipment, pretty much is all similar, but they were off not by a little. They were off by a bunch. And, the fact that they were dealing with a scenario, i.e. pressure, you can't discount that. It caused people to think and make decisions that were not what they would have come up with when they drew it up a month earlier.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We're not really talking about fine margins here. Let's get into the race then, because it's chaotic from the very start. Scott Goodyear swooped past the two Menards cars to lead into turn one. But a few rows back, one-off starter Stan Fox had one of the most terrifying accidents in the modern era. A crash, as Matt said, made famous by how clear some of the photographs are of it. Fox was a successful midgets racer who'd become a regular once a year in the 500. And in 1995, he'd qualified 11th. But at turn one, he got too low in the corner. Then his car spun up the track and into Eddie Cheever and the wall. The impact split Fox's chassis open at the front, leaving him strapped in, but totally exposed as his car flew through the air just above Cheever's car and effectively going along the barrier. He suffered a serious head injury and went into surgery that night to remove a blood clot on his brain. But remarkably, despite having no protection in front of him or around his body or his legs in the accident, the only injury he suffered to the lower half of his body was a result of banging his foot on the rear wing of Cheever's car when he was in midair. Cheever said years later that Fox's car ran into him like a torpedo, and Cheever was so annoyed that when he got out of his car, he went looking for someone to argue with. Those were his words. But when he approached Fox's car and saw the condition he was in, he just had to walk away. Eddie does say that apparently he took Fox's earplugs out when the medical team removed his helmet, and he's not sure why he did that. Fox did recover from his injuries, although he never raced again, and then he died in a road traffic accident in 2000. Matt, you've already mentioned the remarkable photos of this crash. Clearly, Fox was in a bad way from this, but as you said at the start, it could and almost should have been so much worse.
It's tricky, isn't it? Because you don't want to suggest that a head injury of this nature and it being a career ender is a lucky escape. But when you look at what was left of the car and how exposed he was, he was fortunate insofar as the front of the car shattering absorbed that bit of impact. And I guess took the energy away from his legs at that point. And then obviously he then hit nothing else with that end from that point onwards as the car spun down the track when it landed off the wall. So extremely lucky on that front. One of the sad things is like that image of Fox surviving that was so clearly in my head the following year in the Toronto IndyCar race in which Jeff Krosnoff was killed, and you get the same image of the car with the front ripped off. And in Krosnoff's case, there were too many other injuries. He actually effectively hit a tree on the other side of the safety fence at Toronto as his car came apart. But as a kind of comparison that shows what that outcome could have been, it's remarkable that Fox got away from that with just that injury.
Well, let's take this just a step further. Stan Fox was a good friend of mine, and the head injury was life-changing for him. He was never the same person. I can remember talking to him on many occasions and essentially staring through his eyes as if he wasn't even there. I think it's pretty safe to say that the fatal accident that cost his life was likely had a lot to do with the fact he got tired. He got tired a lot his head injury. It just, again, it was, and it really kind of chokes me up. It was such a life-changing situation for him.
And just very briefly, Curt, obviously bearing in mind that you were close to him, the world was a different place in 1995. If this accident happens today, those photographs are going to be on social media within minutes, probably. When you're at the circuit, the race carries on. What's this? Is there a void of information? People won't see these images immediately. The TV coverage isn't great. You see the aftermath, obviously, but you don't see the photos that we've seen. How different was it back then, trying to find out what's really going on?
Well, we've referenced a little bit the 92. We loosely did the 92 Indy 500, and so many leg injuries and dramatic crashes. We had seen some of those. Others, of course, Rick Mears had one several years earlier at San Air. You'd see those, and certainly while dramatic, the television camera certainly caught the image of Stan, but you're just trying to get more information, and it was slow to come out.
Now, before our next break, make sure you send us your questions for the end of the series, where we'll answer anything you want to ask us about F1's V10 era. We do occasionally answer a 90s kart question on there too, particularly if Matt's on the show as well. So if that's your thing, send them in. Send your questions to Bring Back V10s at the-race.com.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first I have to tell you all about this game-changing product I use before a night out with drinks. It's called Z-Biotics Pre-Alcohol. Pre-Alcohol is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make Z-Biotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly and you'll feel your best tomorrow. I won't lie, I was a bit on the fence about Z-Biotics initially, but I gave it a shot and I was impressed with the results. Vacations, weddings, birthdays and reunions, there's so much going on. Get the most out of your summer plans by stocking up on pre-alcohol now. Go to zbiotics.com/race to get 15% off your first order when you use RACE at checkout. Pre-alcohol is backed with 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/race and use the code RACE at checkout for 15% off. Thank you, Z-Biotics, for sponsoring this episode and our good times.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
This episode is brought to you by our good friends at NFL Sunday Ticket on YouTube TV. I'm sure by now you've all gotten back into your Sunday routines, but they could be even better. With NFL Sunday Ticket and YouTube TV, you get the most live NFL games all in one place, every game, every Sunday. And you can even watch up to 4 different games at once with Multiview, one of my favorite inventions of this decade. It's exactly what you need to catch all the action. Make your Sundays more magical. And also, YouTube TV is great. I got it this year. It's awesome. Sign up now at youtube.com/BS. Device and content restrictions apply. Local and national games on YouTube TV. NFL Sunday Ticket for out-of-market games. Excludes digital-only games.
Once the race restarted after the yellow flag period for that crash, Lyondike and Michael Andretti had spells in the lead, but confusion struck when the next yellow flag came out for debris during a pit cycle. Most cars had already come in, leaving Jacques Villeneuve in the lead as he was yet to pit. But Villeneuve and his Team Green crew didn't know he was in the lead, so they didn't tell him that he should line up behind the pace car. Villeneuve passed the pace car twice, only avoiding doing so a third time when he spotted an official hanging out of the side of it, trying to stop him. And Villeneuve then came into the pits as soon as the pace car had picked him up and the pits were open anyway. He was then quickly given a 2-lap penalty for this, with USAC Chief Steward Tom Binford calling it a flagrant violation, saying Villeneuve acted as if there hadn't been a yellow flag and he just didn't slow down. Team boss Barry Green said that not only did he not realise Villeneuve was leading because it was during a pit sequence, but he believed the pace car waved Villeneuve by both times before finally getting him to pull into line. Green told the Indianapolis website years later that his plan for the race had been to stay away from the lead for the first 450 miles and just run in the top 10, so it hadn't crossed the team's mind that Jacques might be in the lead. Villeneuve said his main focus was on if he was going to run out of fuel before the pits opened, and that he said he was waved by the pace car, and when he came back around to it again and it still hadn't picked up the leader, he couldn't believe it, but he still didn't know he was the leader. Curt, there's been a lot of dispute over this, with Villeneuve and his team saying they were waved by. The officials say they weren't. Did it ever become clear what actually happened here and who might be at fault?
No, I don't think it ever really did. And, again, we get lost in today's game where race control has, 50 cameras around the racetrack and television will pick up things, nuances, in-car cameras, go down timelines around the racetrack. And there's so many ways to now not only track the cars, but to communicate with them that it seems impossible that this happened. If you're a relatively new race fan or jumping into the story at this time, I like Matt, maybe you did as well, Glenn. I went back, a week or so ago and watched that race very intently, knowing some of the topics we were going to address and watching for things like Villeneuve's moves and Scott Goodyear's later. I couldn't find anything that would suggest that this was a problem. And then when it did happen, and he went 2 laps down, first of all, I can't remember a situation where somebody was given a 2-lap penalty in the history of my time in the sport. You get a stop and go on pit road. That's a pretty, a stop and hold. Maybe you get a 30-second hold on a road course, which costs you a lap, but 2 laps just taken away like that. It's certainly was a bold penalty, and again, I couldn't see it on the television at the time. And then it was, even as you're watching the race, and I encourage everyone to go find that. It's such a great race to watch. It isn't until there's about 20, 30 laps to go, or 30 laps before Scott Goodyear's penalty that comes up later. Villeneuve is barely mentioned. So it's not a developing storyline the way it might have been today. Of course, he was also just a second-year driver. Yes, he was successful. He had finished second the year before. He certainly was someone to watch, but he wasn't played up as an eventual winner the way you might have expected today.
Yeah, and as I said at the start, lots of people think that we only chose this race because Jacques won it, because he's my guy. But I think we've got quite far in before we've really started talking about him. You said there that obviously we've gone back and watched this race in preparation for this. I think I watch it roughly once a year, but it never gets old. It's as you say, it's a crazy race. We've got a lot more to cover here. But Matt, the confusion around Villeneuve caused a massive delay, actually, to the pits being opened, which was bad news so close to the end of a fuel run for those who hadn't pitted yet. The biggest loser here was Scott Pruitt, who'd been running near the front, but he ran out of fuel before the pits opened. He managed to coast in with a dead engine, but lost a lot of time and fell off the lead lap, which incensed his team boss Pat Patrick, who called the rules around closing the pits until the pace car found the leader, which, as we've just explained, took a long time this time. He called those rules stupid. Matt, as Curt said, there's a lot more technology involved in this process now, but is there ever a neat way to handle what to do with access to the pits around caution periods, particularly in oval racing? It feels like it's still a topic of discussion even today.
Yeah, the greater technology doesn't make a difference in the end. Really, there's no way to do this without screwing somebody at some point, and I can't even begin to think how many different iterations of pits closed, pits open rules I saw during my time following IndyCar, even in the 90s, let alone since. And there'd always be winners and losers from it. There's not really a perfect solution. I hated some of the solutions where people just kept pitting earlier and earlier, because it got to a point at times where not having made your pit stop before a caution was so costly in some of the scenarios that played out later in Champ Car. So yeah, there's not a neat way to do this. You have to, it's that real old Mario Andretti stereotype quote about yellows sometimes work with you, sometimes work against you. Pit closures sometimes work with you, sometimes work against you. Just especially if the crash happens in turn 4, affects the pit entry as well, it changes the game again. So no, you just have to live with it, I think.
Even, obviously, F1 has faced its own problems with this. We used to close the pits in F1. F1 has you have a delta time that you have to stick to get back to the pits to stop people rushing back to the pits now. But even there, we know it's advantageous if you haven't stopped yet, and then you can make your stop while everyone else is going more slowly. So even when the rules try to even it out for everybody, as you say, Matt, somebody still gets screwed. Something I wanted to quickly flag this up here, and we talked about it briefly earlier when talking about Penske, to show the contrast between IndyCar racing back then and today. By lap 45 of this race, there were only 10 cars still running on the lead lap. If you compare that to 2024, at the same point in the race, there were 26 cars on the lead lap, and by the end of the Indy 500 in 2024, 21 cars were still running on the lead lap. Curt, what was it about the racing back then that made it so different to today? Was it just the quality of the field, be that drivers, teams, equipment? Was it all just more spread out back then?
Well, it was spread out. I'm sure quality of the teams had a lot to do with it. Let's don't kid ourselves. However, I think the access to budgets, the fact that you could adjust the technology on your car and you could do different things, and it kind of separated the haves from the have-nots. I mean, earlier we talked about just the discrepancy in speed between, a 218 that Al Jr. ran in practice while trying to get to 225. I mean, you just don't have those kind of separations in speed today because everybody's largely got the same equipment. The other thing that has happened is you have so much interchangeable crew members today and engineers. I mean, you might have an engineer because most of the teams based in Indianapolis. It's an easy switch, the fluid of movement within teams. So ideas are shared. Secrets are not kept because crew members move around. Everybody kind of learns the tricks of the trade, and we've been operating with the same basic equipment package for quite some time. So all those things come into play. Yes, you certainly had, have and have not teams, and the teams today are just closer to one another. But some would argue that the old way, in the 90s, was a better situation. But in terms of competition, today is really the zenith of that.
Yeah, the races just play out so differently now. Moving on slightly to around sort of the mid-70s on the lap count, Mauricio Gugelmin was leading the race with Michael Andretti running second. Gugelmin slowed in turn 4 to pit, and as Andretti went to the outside of him, he ran into the marbles on the track and slid straight into the wall. Andretti's suspension was damaged and he was out of another Indy 500. He said afterwards the track felt like ice offline, and years later he said he couldn't even see the marbles, so he didn't know they were there. When he was interviewed straight after getting out of the car, he said it was the best car he'd ever had at Indy. He dismissed the idea that this was another example of the Andretti curse at Indianapolis, which became a thing because so much bad luck befell him and his dad Mario at the race. But Michael said, I don't believe in that. Ultimately, it was my mistake. Matt, do you think Andretti had one of the strongest cars in this race? Was he destined to be a factor if he'd kept going?
Yeah, it looked that way, didn't it? But with the caveat that he retired pretty early, and you don't really know at Indy until the last 20 or so laps. That was true then as it is now. The Andretti curse is mad, though, isn't it? Like, it's not just the Andrettis, but the fact Newman Haas never got an Indy 500 win in among all its success is just insane to think about now, given how synonymous it was with IndyCar victories back then.
Yeah, Michael said there, I don't believe in it. I think I do. Kurt, do you believe in the Andretti curse?
Well, I will say, and I think this is the right stat, an Andretti owner has won the Indy 500 now 5 times with, I think, 5 different drivers. So the drivers themselves have not proven to be, or the employees of an Andretti have not been cursed. Yeah. But I do think there's something to it. Marco made a big mistake in 2006 to lose the Indy 500. And you can go down through a long list of mechanical issues and mistakes and so forth, more mechanical than mistakes, but issues with the Andretti drivers over the years. But yeah, it's a fascinating tale. There are so many elements to the Indy story. The Unsers having such success, the Andrettis having success but not completing the task at hand certainly is a great contrast.
Yeah, so moving back to Villeneuve then, how did he get his 2 laps back?
Because it's always about Villeneuve. It's always about Villeneuve.
See, you've caught on, yeah. This is your first full show and you've worked it out already. He got 1 lap back quite quickly, running long in another pit sequence before a yellow flag came out. And he just kept running long in each stint. And he got back on the lead lap by lap 124 when another yellow came out. That's led to some claims down the years that he didn't really race his way back from 2 laps down. But Villeneuve said every lap was like a quali lap. And in fairness, at this point in the race, he had set the fastest lap of the race as well. So he wasn't hanging around. There was a restart, I seem to remember, where he was at the front and he stayed at the front, ahead of the leaders. Back in 2012, I was lucky enough to get to speak to Jacques about this race at length for Autosport when he chose it as the race of his life. As I mentioned at the start of the show, he started that interview by saying he ranks it above the 1997 F1 title decider at Jerez. He admitted that one time we were lucky with getting a lap back due to the timing of a yellow flag, but he felt that the rest of the time he was just racing hard the whole time, which he said wasn't the way at Indy back then. Barry Green said years later for that Indy 500 DVD box set that I mentioned that there were certain segments of the race where Jacques drove the wheels off of it. Kurt, where do you stand on this? Was it impressive or lucky the way Jacques got his 2 laps back?
Well, there's always has to be some luck. You cannot drive effectively 5 miles farther than everyone else, and even in that era when it was a little more separation of speed, it does take luck. I noticed in watching the race here last week, just how aggressively he picked up positions in his comeback. So he clearly was driving at a pace that wasn't being shown by everyone else on the track. Today's racing, again, it's difficult to remember this from afar, but today's race is very much a sprint race at the Indy 500. I mean, it's 3 hours of you better be in giddy-up mode for the full stint. There's just not much lollygagging, and there clearly was no lollygagging from Jacques on that day, and it would have been very comparable to how racing is today, full throttle, 500 laps, 200 laps, 500 miles.
Scott Pruitt was another driver recovering from the lap he lost when he ran out of fuel because the pits were closed. And part of the reason he was able to do that was by double stinting his Firestone tyres, which was a huge deal. He got himself back in the hunt and he was involved in a battle with Jimmy Vasser that ended with Vasser crashing at turn 3 with 30 laps to go. Pruitt then crashed with 15 laps to go when chasing leader Scott Goodyear, and it turned out he'd crashed on oil dropped by another car. I think it was Raul Boesel, wasn't it? Goodyear had taken the lead from Pruitt on the previous restart when Pruitt eased off because he was catching the pace car, and this would be a precursor to the decisive moment of the race. But with Pruitt out, it was now a battle of the Canadians out front, with Goodyear leading from Villeneuve under caution, heading into the final laps. Goodyear had been fast all race, and it boiled down to his Honda-powered Reynard on Firestones against Villeneuve's Cosworth-powered Reynard on Goodyear's. Villeneuve told me back in that 2012 interview, Scott was unbeatable. There was no way I could keep up with him. Barry Green disagreed, saying on the Indy 500 DVD, Scott knew he was beaten. He knew Jacques was much faster than he was, and he knew where Jacques had come from, i.e. being 2 laps down. Matt, who do you think was right? Was Villeneuve right that Scott was unbeatable, or was Barry Green right that Scott was maybe getting... Well, Scott thought he was beaten because some guys behind him, he was 2 laps down earlier.
Fair point on both sides. Villeneuve coming back to the field like that reminded me of so many Alex Zanardi charges that I loved. In the TV coverage, he's not being talked about, like Curt said. You're just seeing this name getting higher and higher up the scoring pylon or the graphics tower. And then suddenly it's almost inevitable. He's got such momentum, and it's brilliant to watch. That said, that Honda engine through the race looks so strong, doesn't it? What the Firestone tyres are doing looks so impressive through the race. I think Goodyear had the better package on the day, but certainly Villeneuve's speed through the pack was very hard to argue with. But I think in terms of who was going to have more grip and more power, it was definitely Scott Goodyear at that point.
Yeah, I think that's how I feel. So on the final restart with 10 laps to go, Goodyear jumped early, but he caught the pace car in the middle of turn 4. Behind him, Villeneuve backed off and stacked the pack up behind him, but Goodyear kept his foot in and swept away into a huge lead. He was nearly 6 seconds clear of Villeneuve, who had to defend pretty aggressively from Christian Fittipaldi on the restart, having backed off behind the pace car, and that allowed everyone to close up behind him. Goodyear blamed the pace car for going too slowly back to the pits, saying it had been a problem all day on restarts. As we mentioned, Pruitt had to back off on a previous one. Scott Goodyear said he thought the pace car might have a problem because it was down on the rumble strips on the inside of turn 4. He said that he didn't want to lift off because he thought he'd cause a huge crash behind him if he did. And he added that anybody that was in the lead on a restart immediately fell back to second or third because this situation was going on all day. So he kept his foot down, and he believed he'd seen a green light in turn 4 anyway, although TV pictures later showed that light was still yellow when he passed the pace car. He didn't get much sympathy from his fellow drivers. Several were quoted at the time, and have been over the years since, saying that if you come across the pace car before the restart, you have to slow down. I did very recently actually see a quote from Arie Luyendyk, who said that he felt this race was stolen from Scott, so maybe he was on his side at least. But Curt, just looking at the offence for now, you know, you catch the pace car, you keep your foot down, you fly past it in turn 4. Was there any justification for Scott Goodyear doing that?
I don't know. I can go back to the restart just prior to that, and Goodyear, and I believe he's following Scott Pruitt, they got a huge jump on the field, and it was almost the same situation. In fact, when it happened in the race broadcast, and when you're watching it, you know, second time or again, you notice just what almost like they're showing the ultimate, you know, pass of the pace car, a restart early, because it's almost the same restart, and they didn't pass the pace car, but it was close. And so I think there was, I mean, and I've talked to Scott about this numerous times, and, you know, from my perspective, it's almost like what happened the restart prior was what he thought, you know, how it should be. And so it was just interesting that it basically happened twice. He just didn't pass him the first time. But I think, you know, you see that pace car, you gotta slow down. I mean, I think that's why he probably didn't get much sympathy from his competitors.
Yeah, I mean, you watch IndyCar racing from this era, and sometimes the pace car would be almost in the pit entry as they go past, and nothing's said. This isn't one of those. You know, this is in turn 4. The pace car, we're very much on the racetrack. We'll come to the implications shortly, but first, let's get into a theory Villeneuve has for why Scott Goodyear did what he did. He said this a few times, but we'll use the quotes he gave to me because It's my show. He said, on the lap before the green flag, I just kept putting pressure on him, accelerating, braking, going next to him, dropping back from him, trying to get into his head. And it worked because he got going before the green flag and overtook the pace car. I've mentioned that Indianapolis website Month of Mayhem article a few times. They released a YouTube clip of them interviewing Scott Goodyear about this. So let's hear his take on that specific claim from Villeneuve.
I would say adamantly no. Wasn't even paying that much attention to him. It didn't matter if it was his car or what other cars. Your job as a starter is to make sure that, as the first car on the start, is to make sure that you're going to go as fast as you can and that you time it right and that you get down, especially here into turn one, that they don't get a draft. Who's to know if he would have had enough to be able to make the draft and the timing was right on his end or what have you. But, sitting in the cockpit getting ready for a restart, I'm not paying that much attention to what he's doing back there. So if he believes that and wants to think that, that's all for him, but absolutely not.
Matt, pretty clear from Goodyear there that he doesn't buy into this theory. Do you think what Villeneuve did before the restart had any effect?
Oh, it's Jacques Villeneuve psychological games territory, which is always so funny, isn't it? It's like all the stuff in F1 later, like, oh yeah, Heinz-Halter-Frentzen was rubbish at Williams because I once threw his dinner away, then dyed my hair purple. It's just, Villeneuve's so fond of trying to accentuate his reputation as a kind of psychological mastermind. That said, just speculating a little bit, who has most to lose in this situation? At this point, Scott Goodyear is 12 years older than Jacques Villeneuve, and he doesn't even have a full-time drive for the year. He's clearly heading towards the tail end of his career, not got a lot of job security at the moment. Jacques Villeneuve, second year of IndyCar, he's kind of found his feet now. His junior career had been all about people wondering if he could ever be anywhere near his dad's reputation as he kind of floundered around a bit. In IndyCar, he's very impressive from the outset. Sixth in the championship as a rookie, looking probably like a potential title contender at this point, although it was very hard to say early in the season. It was about consistency quite a lot. He has got all the time in the world ahead of him. He's being talked about in terms of F1 already. He's not got a lot to lose. Scott Goodyear has a huge amount to lose here. This must have felt in that moment like his probably last chance at winning the Indy 500, the race he'd come so close to winning before and been denied in quite agonizing circumstances. So complete amateur psychology speculating there, but I think if anyone was going to bottle it is a harsh phrase under this sort of pressure, but I'll use it, bottle it on that restart, it was going to be Goodyear given everything that was riding on the line for him, and Villeneuve could afford not to care quite as much.
2 laps after this restart, Goodyear was given the black flag for passing the pace car. He ignored it, so on lap 196, 4 from the end, race officials announced they were no longer scoring him. So although he was the first car on the road still, Villeneuve was now the race leader. Goodyear was told of his penalty over the radio, but he had a very clear reason for staying out. He referenced his karting career from when he was a kid, saying he would be black flagged for an offence, come into the pits, then told it was a mistake by the officials. And he said, they're not going to put you back where you were and give you back the victory. He said he was very calm in the car, telling his team boss, Steve Horn, that he wasn't coming in because the penalty made no sense. And he said Horn responded by telling him to keep his foot on the gas. Goodyear said coming out of turn 4 on the last lap, he wondered if they would show him the checkered flag, but they didn't, holding off until Villeneuve approached the finish line. Scott said he was in disbelief and was disappointed because he didn't agree with the penalty, and I have to say he still doesn't agree with it today. Post-race, he claimed it was a surprise not to be waved into victory lane, and he said everybody throughout the world knows who won this race. He told the Indianapolis Star years later that some people told him to take legal action, but he didn't think that was the right thing to do because it would tarnish the race. And he didn't want to damage his reputation in Canada, given that, and these are Goodyear's words, the other guy they gave the victory to was Canadian. Curt, you've said that you've spoken to Scott about this. Do you have sympathy for him, and do you understand why he stayed out and ignored the flag?
I think you have to stay out. The penalty, whether it puts you second in the running order or 5th or 14th, as it turned out, is insignificant. Your face is not on the Borg-Warner Trophy. Doesn't matter. Who cares who finished second? There's a great book, Second to None, which is one of the great books about drivers who finished second in the Indy 500. And honestly, you'd be hard-pressed to remember who finished second most of the year. So stay out. I think that was the right call. The idea that, he was surprised they didn't wave him into victory lane. Surely he knew better, but obviously in the moment, you believe what you want to believe. I look at Scott's career as a series of near misses. He might be, the closest to victory lane of any driver that never won the race. He was within a blink of winning in 92. He had this moment in 95, and then he chased Arie Luyendyk in a one-lap shootout in 97 to the checkered flag when Arie got a big jump on him. So, to finish second in those, essentially second in all three of those moments, the collection of them is how I think Scott Goodyear's career is remembered. But I do think he's the point about not challenging this from a legal standpoint. Remember in 1981, this became illegal. It was drawn out in the courts. It became kind of a messy situation for the race and for Bobby Unser and for Mario Andretti. Those feelings have never completely been resolved. Mario still wears the winner's ring. And, in Scott's case, he's a great businessman. So good for him to kind of play it right.
Yeah, I'm glad he didn't try and make a legal thing of this. Ultimately, if you get it back in the courts, it's not quite the same, is it, as drinking the milk on the day. So Goodyear wasn't shown the flag, but a few seconds later, fellow Canadian Villeneuve was, crossing the line 2.5 seconds ahead of Christian Fittipaldi and Bobby Rahal, who came up to third. Villeneuve said afterwards that he'd been swearing in his helmet when he heard about the 2-lap penalty because he didn't think it was possible to come back from. He called Indy the greatest race in the world, saying winning here is like winning a championship. When I spoke to him about this in 2012, he said he didn't understand the history of the race back then, as when he was growing up, his legendary dad Gilles didn't care about history, so I didn't grow up with any ideas of history or why something was important. But by 2012, he said, with the time to look back at everything, to have been part of that history is amazing. For me, that was the race, and I can still remember it so well. Villeneuve and the people from Team Green still call that race the 505 because of having to run 2 extra laps to win. And that was such a remarkable achievement that it confused some other teams in the pits, actually. Scott Goodyear's boss, Steve Horn, even said post-race that they were hoping to get the decision to black flag Goodyear reversed because he thought officials had already reversed one decision today, referencing Villeneuve's penalty because he thought it'd been scratched off. He didn't realise Jacques had made the laps back up. Team boss Barry Green said on the Indy 500 DVD box set that Horn wasn't the only one, adding, a lot of people to this day think we got those laps given back, but we actually ran 505 miles. I don't think there was a lot of giving about it. We won it. Matt, there's no such thing as a run-of-the-mill Indy 500 win, let's be fair, but does the added element of the 2-lap penalty elevate Villeneuve's achievement? Does it make this one stand the test of time more?
Yeah, as a pure performance accolade, absolutely winning it the way he won it makes this so impressive. In terms of how it stands up in history, the fact he was going to F1 the following year would have given this an extra kind of resonance. It would have been an Indy 500 more people knew about than a lot of them at that point in terms of like global racing. But also, as you know probably better than any of us, Glenn, is Jacques Villeneuve. He would have found a way to make this dramatic or messy somehow, that he wouldn't have had a forgettable Indy 500 win.
Yep, I'll accept that. Let's finish then. Last topic. We're going to revisit the politics around IndyCar racing at this time, and we're going to end kind of where we started, which is talking about the split. Because when all the teams packed up and left Indy, they all assumed they'd be back in 1996, but for most of them, especially the biggest teams, it would be years before they raced there again. In July of 1995, Indianapolis and Indy Racing League boss Tony George announced the rule that obliterated any chances of the two competing series coexisting in relative harmony when he revealed that 25 of the 33 starting spots on the Indy 500 grid would be reserved for full-time IRL competitors. The kart teams could still turn up if they wanted to, but they'd be competing for just 8 open spots in the race. Then kart boss Andrew Craig said in the Indy split book that this bombshell announcement came because Tony George didn't have enough cars for the IRL. Craig added, "It was a troubling moment. I guess we had probably thought the IRL would never happen. Obviously, Tony reached the same conclusion, which is why he made that rule." Curt, you were in the thick of this. You were covering the beginnings of this war for the Indy Star. What did you think in the summer of 95 when you heard about this rule?
Well, keep in mind that Indianapolis had always been an open competition. You know, whoever, you didn't have to be anything, anybody, build your car and come participate. And so I think that's the genesis of the frustration that everybody felt. It certainly was, create a very awkward situation. And you could see the writing on the wall then at that point. And even those that supported Tony, you're just caught in a strange situation. I understand why he had that feeling of loyalty to those that came and followed him. Think about, AJ Foyt. Think about Arie Luyendyk and Scott Goodyear and, Menard and others that came and supported the IRL. But you could also understand the frustration of those on the Champ Car side. So a very obviously turning moment. The one thing I would add, one more element to the story that we've not really talked about, but just think about the new blood that was in the sport at that point as well. We're talking about, a Jimmy Vasser, as if he is the Jimmy Vasser that we've come to know. He was very much a young driver in that 95 race. Scott Pruitt the same way. Scott Goodyear, while maybe on the back end of his career, Villeneuve, there were only 3 former winners in that race. So many new names, Honda being in, Firestone, it had such momentum. And that momentum really lost coming out of 95 and then into 96. So I think, of all the stress and frustrations and tension and casualties that we saw in the sport as we moved in 96, 97, 98, I think what we really like, Glenn's love of Jacques Villeneuve aside, I think what we really like about 95, it was the 95 Indy 500 was still such a celebration of everything that was good about IndyCar racing up until that point. And then after that, it got messy. And, in all divorces, it gets ugly and people choose sides and feelings are hurt and there are casualties, financial and personal, and Michael Andretti and Unser Jr. lost years of their Indy 500 lives. Others did as well. Alex Zanardi, Jimmy Vasser celebration should have been, key to what followed. So just, there was just so many, and there were some good things. Tony Stewart got a chance, and certainly others. But nobody likes conflict. Nobody likes the tension, unnecessary, the politics of the sport as we talk about, and really the 25-8 kind of cemented the tension that was in the air already and helped really spoil what was a glorious day in the 95 Indy 500.
That's so true, Curt. My strongest feeling rewatching this race in the last few days before the podcast was actually by the end of it just feeling sad and a bit angry almost that this was the end of that era in a way. Like you say, one of the things I loved about 95, both the Indy 500 and the full season, was how open it was. We had 7 different teams win races. It had been so long of feeling like IndyCar was all about Penske and Newman Haas with the occasional interloper, and now suddenly it was exploding with teams like Ganassi coming through, but not just like the big teams that had gone to win championships. Teams like Tasman and Pac West could start picking off race wins over the following years. It was something so special that there was a whole new guard of drivers coming in who were choosing IndyCar or Champ Car by then over F1 as a preference because they felt they'd get better opportunities there. The quality was fantastic. The racing was fantastic. It was so open. And the Indianapolis 500 was not part of it. And just think how much better both could have been with each other through that period. It's really heartbreaking. And for me, it's heartbreaking as someone who was just a teenage fan at the time. I am nothing to IndyCar and the Indy 500. The heartbreak for the people who had given so much of their life's work, their savings, their lives in some cases, for this race and for this championship, to see that happen because of politics above them across those years is actually really horrible to think about. I'm not going to go tragic because there are actual tragedies in sport. This wasn't that, but it is so sad. And like you say, Curt, 25-8 was the thing that made this. That was the no way back moment. So when it reminds me as well, when they reunified in 2008, I did a kind of timeline piece for the Autosport website. I spent a day going through back issues and old auto courses, just plotting basically kind of the first rumblings through to reunification, all the twists and turns, just straight kind of almost like Bring Back V10s research notes, Glenn.
I was going to say, sounds familiar.
Yeah, we ran that on the website, and Andrew Craig messaged Autosport afterwards saying he wants to take issue with a few things in it. And I was a little bit nervous about then phoning him up, but we had the most amazing, I think, almost 2.5 hour conversation where Andrew Craig basically went through this timeline article line by line, giving his own take on it 12 years removed. And there were a few things he did take issue with how we characterised, but most of it was just him being very open about his own failings at different times as well, and how he and Curt should have done better. But one of the things that really sticks in my mind that he picked up on was, I think I'd written a phrase along the lines of the Curt teams brusquely retaliated to 25-8 by scheduling their own US 500 in a direct clash with the Indy 500 from 96. And Andrew Craig was like, okay, brusque is not the wrong word. What else could we do? I had Roger Penske and all the manufacturers, all the sponsors saying you have to have a show of force back against this. And yeah, at the time, I was an angry teenager in 96, hating Tony George and the IRL for spoiling something I was just getting into. Obviously, I've mellowed since then. I see both sides a lot more, but I can't help feeling still that if he hadn't gone for 25-8, maybe there would have been a way back and we could have seen something even more special in the late 90s.
Yeah, it's you know, any anger you may have felt around this sort of thing subsides over time. You just kind of get left with sadness. You know, I love the Indy 500. Even today, it's my favourite motorsport event of the year. If someone said to me, you can only watch one race in any series of every year, I'd pick the Indy 500 every year. I've been there once. I absolutely loved it. I loved it back then. I was devastated as a fan that what we had in 95 didn't get to continue. You know, Curt was great for a few more years after that, but it didn't have its showpiece event. So we'll leave it there before the three of us start dissecting the rest of the 1990s and covering the split. Maybe we'll do that another time.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Thanks to Matt for dusting off your love of all things Curt. I know it doesn't really accumulate much dust, to be honest. But a special thank you to Curt for bringing your first-hand perspective to all of this and to giving us so much of your time. Next time out, we are heading back to the cosy world of F1's V10 era as we revisit the first season of Jackie Stewart's Stewart Grand Prix team.
What a story. Comfortably one of the best 500s or 505s in recent memory. And as always, with Bring Back V10s, beautifully told. Speaking of which, they've also done an episode with a similar cast, including Curt Cavin or Nigel Mansell's 1993 season in IndyCar when he won the championship at the first time of asking after leaving Formula One. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the episode, and don't forget, if you love what we do here at The Race and want ad-free and additional podcast content, you can now find us on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/The Race and sign up. We'll be back with a special guest on next week's The Race IndyCar podcast ahead of the Gateway Oval, kicking off a 5-race run to the end of the 2024 season. See you then.